What is up, guys, and welcome back to another video. And today we are going over the 10 creepiest moments in Family Guy history. Coming in at number 10, we have Perfect Castaway. In this episode, Peter's business as a fisherman starts to go under. In order to feed his family, Peter goes in search for fish with Cleveland, Joe, and Quagmire tagging along. While they do this, there is a hurricane that causes a giant wave that sinks their boat. They survive by floating on a raft built out of Quagmire's sex dolls. While floating, Peter reveals that he has been eating Joe's legs. The four men set ashore on a desert island. Several months later, they decide to have an orgy while a cruise ship rescues them and the men return home. Once home, however, Lois tells Peter that she thought he was dead and she married Brian and that he supports the family and she cannot just leave Brian after all he has done for the family. In an attempt to win Lois back, Peter goes to the house, where Lois finds him naked on a couch covered in whipped cream. His plan succeeds and they have sex. However, Stewie videotapes them and shows the tape to Brian. Brian goes to confront them, but he overhears Lois explain to Peter that although she loves him, she made a commitment to Brian. Brian leaves without confronting them, and when Lois returns home, he tells her he wants to break up because he doesn't think she's right for him, and then she goes back with Peter. Lois is highly grateful of Brian and they remain friends. Number 9, Quagmire's dad. This episode features Quagmire's father, Dan Quagmire, who returns to Quahog. Peter and Joe first think he is gay due to his mannerisms. Eventually, Dan states he is not gay, but instead he is a woman trapped in a man's body, and he decides to have a sex reassignment surgery to become physically female during his stay in Quahog. Meanwhile, while all this is happening, Brian is away attending a seminar. Upon returning, he meets an attractive blonde named Ida at a Marriott and has a sexual affair with her. What he does not realize is that Ida is Quagmire's post-operative father. Brian promptly vomits for a good amount of time when he realizes he had an affair with Quagmire's father. Quagmire is furious when he finds out that his father hooked up with Brian, whom he can't stand. They go to the Griffin's house where Brian hides under the bed. Quagmire finds him and easily beats him up. What an odd and disturbing episode. Number 8, Peter Geist. After Joe builds a home theater, Peter decides to build a multiplex in his backyard out of jealousy. While digging, Peter finds the skull of a Native American buried in the backyard. Brian urges him to return the skull to its resting place, but Peter treats it as a novelty, playing with it, urinating in it, and wearing it as an athletic cup. Stewie talks to the TV, the chairs and refrigerator stack themselves upside down on the kitchen table, and Peter rips at the flesh on his face until he uncovers Hank Hill's face. Lois is in denial until Stewie gets stuck in the closet and disappears. Lois eventually saves Stewie, but the enraged spirits ravage on the Griffin house and suck it into their world. Peter dumps the skull in a garbage can as the now homeless Griffins drive off. They learn that in order to get their house back, the skull has to be back and into its resting place. They search the city dump where they find out Carrot Top has taken the skull for a prop. They retrieve the skull from Carrot Top's mansion and return it to its spot in the backyard, and life gets back to normal. Number 7, the Fat Guy Strangler. Lois learns she has a long-lost brother and that her brother Patrick has been shut away in a mental hospital for decades ever since he suffered a nervous breakdown as a young child upon walking in on his mother having an affair. Believing Patrick to be sane, Lois authorizes his release and arranges for him to stay with the family. Peter unintentionally traumatizes Patrick, and this triggers him to start killing fat people. Lois's father calls her and tells her how dangerous he really is, but she assures he is safe, although she becomes very worried after seeing on the news that a fat man has been murdered. Lois remains in denial as more murders are committed. Lois continues to make crazy excuses, but she ultimately snaps out of her denial and realizes that he is dangerous. Lois and Brian pursue Patrick and Peter into the woods, where Patrick is strangling Peter. Patrick apologizes, telling Lois that he never meant to hurt her, and the two agree he should be sent back to the mental hospital. Number 6, Peter Normal Activity. Peter, Quagmire, and Cleveland and Joe decide to head to the abandoned Quahog Asylum. As they share scary stories, they begin to hear strange noises and footsteps in the distance. The four get frightened and try to evacuate, but discover they have been locked in. They end up encountering a hook-handed man, and they flee past him and get outside. But then they realize that they are 4 against 1, so they attack and inadvertently kill him. Unfortunately, they discover he is a property caretaker named Albert who lost his hand saving the lives of fellow American soldiers in the Korean War. Quagmire wants to confess the murder, but he's overruled. They bury Albert's body and his car while making a pact to keep the murder a secret. After that, Peter has a sleepless night and deals with coincidences that are similar to the circumstances of the murder. Quagmire denies his involvement and reveals he forged an alibi, prompting Peter to return to the Quag Asylum to frame Quagmire for the murder. Once he is there, he finds that the other three are already there, all planning to frame each other. Before they assault each other with shovels, Peter sees this as an inspiration for a horror film. Afterwards, they see Albert in a newspaper as he is reported missing and revealed to be a KKK leader who stole war medals. Back at the asylum, Albert's hook rises from the grave and his car door rises in the same way. Number 5, Halloween on Spooner Street. In this creepy Halloween episode, Peter and Joe decide to target Quagmire for this year's Halloween pranks. This includes throwing eggs at Quagmire, dressing Joe up as a girl and sleeping with him, and the creepiest prank of all, infecting him with an unknown disease carried by a mosquito. After their pranks, Peter praises Quagmire for being a good sport, and the two decide to go drinking. Deciding to approach Joe, they convince him to allow them to follow him in the police car, agreeing to do so only if they stay in his car. Peter and Quagmire soon become a problem. Ultimately, they drive to an old airfield where they discover a Japanese fighting plane used during World War II. Quagmire flies the two into the sky and eventually takes them on a high-speed dive into the ocean near Quahog Harbor, stopping only inches away from crashing, stating that it was payback for making him have sex with Joe. Number 4, and then there were fewer. The residents of Quahog are invited to a dinner party in by James Woods, who states he has become a born-again Christian thanks to his new girlfriend Priscilla. Early into the night, Quagmire's companion, Stephanie, is mysteriously shot when she sits in Woods' seat, leading the guests to believe Woods intends to murder them all. They all try to leave, but a storm stops them. Woods pleads ignorance before he is too murdered in front of the guests by an unseen killer with a knife during a power outage, causing Priscilla to faint. The guests realize that the killer is among them. While the guests search for the clues in discovering the killer's identity, they realize that many of them have motives for wanting revenge on James Woods. More people die, with everyone pointing the finger at each other. Eventually, they all figure out it was news anchor Tom and he is arrested by the police. Lois goes to confront his co-anchor Diane, only to realize she is the true murderer when Diane shows a dress for her solo debut on the news, even though she couldn't have known that Tom would be leaving. Diane eventually reveals that she had dated Woods until he dumped her upon her 40th birthday, around which Tom arranged for her to be replaced on Channel 5 News. Looking for revenge, Diane bribed Priscilla to make James become a born-again Christian and throw the dinner party so she can murder Woods and frame Tom for the crime. Diane then admits to silence Lois by forcing her outside to a nearby cliff, only to be shot down herself with a sniper rifle fired by Stewie. That's an awful lot of murder for one episode. Number 3, Quagmire's Quagmire. In this episode, Quagmire fries his computer. Taking it in for service, Sonia the clerk discovers his taste in porn and they end up on a date. Quagmire wakes up the next morning handcuffed to the bed and discovers he was drugged to have sex and decides that he has finally found his true love. They engage in a variety of sexual acts, including having sex with his father. At the Drunken Clam, Peter and Joe discover Quagmire's hiding blackened eyes. Leaving the clam, Sonia meets him outside, beats him, and shuts him in the trunk of his car, claiming that she is satisfying his fantasies of being dominated and humiliated as she drives away with him. Days later, Ida, Quagmire's father, shows up at Peter's door and expresses concern that Quagmire hasn't been seen for days. The guys search for Quagmire by going to all his usual places. Wandering into a seedy area, they find people who know Sonia and are directed to a storage container. Finding Quagmire, they are concerned by Sonia, who takes Joe's gun. She pulls the trigger, but Joe tackles her, admitting he keeps his gun unloaded following an incident the previous year. Quagmire admits later that he'll need to be the really kinky one in the future relationships as he worries about his dad being pregnant. Number 2, Foreign Affairs. Bonnie and Lois take a trip to Paris, but Lois becomes shocked when Bonnie announces that she has plans on having an affair. Bonnie meets a French guy who begs her to stay. Lois contacts Joe, who convinces her to come back home, but that's not the creepy part. After seeing a breakout of the goat flu on the news, Peter decides to homeschool Chris and Meg. However, Peter's teaching methods prove to be insane when he strips down naked and rides a scooter around the garage classroom while encouraging Chris and Meg to do the same. Chris joins in and is given an A while Meg resists and is given an F. After a field trip to the desert, Peter gives a final exam. After discovering Chris knows absolutely nothing, he agrees to send the kids back to school. Back in school, Chris's teacher rides naked around the classroom on a scooter. What did I just watch? And number 1, the life of Brian. The plot centers around the death of Brian Griffin. Stewie and Brian find a street hockey net and take it home. The first time they set it up, Brian is hit and crushed by an out-of-control driver. At the vet, the Griffins learn that Brian's injuries are too overwhelming to overcome, and the family say their goodbyes. Just before he dies, Brian expresses his love for his family, thanking them for the wonderful life they gave him. It was literally one of the saddest moments in cartoon history.